Hi everyone, this is David. Welcome back to part 2 of Introduction to US Submarines in World War II. Today we're going to talk about the torpedo. Now, a submarine's primary anti-ship weapon has always been the torpedo. Popular usage of the word defines a torpedo as an underwater self-propelled explosive device. I mean, that's what we all think of. But historically, this has not always been the case. The term was also applied to primitive naval mines and spar torpedoes mounted, charges placed on the end of a long spar of an attacking ship. Following the US Civil War in 1865 and now the iconic battles of the Monitor and Merrimack, navies around the world began replacing their large wooden ships of the line with better protected ironclads. These would lead to the development of today's modern battleships. But these new ships were expensive, and the huge guns needed to penetrate an enemy ship's armor, they were heavy and slow to reload. Many of the world's navies sought to develop a self-propelled torpedo that could be launched from cheaper and easy-to-build small surface vessels like coastal gunboats or even fishing vessels. In 1866, British engineer and inventor Robert Whitehead developed the first fully self-propelled projectile that traveled under or on the water. Torpedo development continued to improve throughout the latter half of the 19th century in control, range, and explosive capability. It's fascinating when you consider that the very idea of a submarine was driven by the concept of the torpedo as far back as 1775 with David Bushnell's Turtle. The submarine eliminates the vulnerability of small surface gunboats from direct fire. One would only need to approach an enemy by stealth, plant an explosive charge underneath the ship's hull, or close within range of a submarine-fired torpedo, and then retire without ever having been seen or even detected. During World War II, the U.S. arguably had the best submarines of any navy in the world with the Gato and Vallejo-class submarines. Their torpedoes, however, they were plagued with problems. Japanese submarines had the excellent Type 93, based on their Type 95 Long Lance. The German Kriegsmarine U-boats also had very effective torpedoes in their Type G7A through E models, the electric. U.S. submarines at the start of the war had the Mark 14 steam torpedo. Now, most Americans hated being dragged into the First World War, so when it was over, the Department of Defense underwent massive budget cuts. And when the stock market crashed in 1929, the resulting economic crisis further curtailed what most saw as an unnecessary government spending. America turned inward and embraced a policy of isolationism. Safe between the two oceans, Americans were not going to allow this country to become involved in another European conflict. Therefore, a large, expensive military was just not needed. Under these financial constraints, development of the Mark 14 to replace the smaller World War I era Mark 10 began in 1931. Ships' hulls were becoming thicker, better armored, and the Mark 10 simply didn't pack a big enough punch. Though both the Mark 10 and the Mark 14 were both 21 inches in diameter, the new Mark 14s were 50 inches longer. The effective firing range was increased from 3,500 to 4,500 yards at a speed of 46 knots. The Mark 10 only had one speed, up to 9,000 yards at 36 knots. The warhead yield was increased from 497 pounds of TNT on the Mark 10, eventually reaching 650 pounds of a new explosive, Torpex, a much more powerful explosive charge on the Mark 14. Like the Mark 10, the Mark 14 also used what was called a wet heater combustion system. Essentially, a mixture of compressed air and ethanol was continuously exploded within a combustion chamber. The chamber was cooled by water from the torpedo's water compartment. In cooling the combustion chamber, the water was converted into high-pressure steam that was used in conjunction with a combustion exhaust to drive a turbine, which in turn powered the torpedo. Now, this is another extreme oversimplification of the process and is intended only to give you an idea of how the torpedo worked. But the Mark 14 had a number of defects that wouldn't be uncovered until the Second World War began. Defects the Bureau of Ordnance would continuously deny. First, it is important to understand that these torpedoes were expensive. $10,000 each in 1941, which translates to over $200,000 apiece in 2024. And the Bureau of Ordnance, during development of the Mark 14, had a very limited budget. Add to that the Navy's refusal to provide them with target ships to test them on. Even though much of the fleet had been mothballed after the First World War, they weren't going to let the Bureau of Ordnance blow up one just to show that their new torpedo worked. So, in defense of the Bureau of Ordnance, they did the best they could with what they had at the time. To their guilt, the Bureau of Ordnance later refused to accept the reports from returning submarine captains during the war that there were problems with the Mark 14. Problems which may have even resulted in the loss of one or more boats. We may never know for sure because the reason why some submarines never return is still unknown to this day. A principal defect with the Mark 14, and one which masked many of the others, was depth control. During development in the 1930s, a number of test torpedoes were fired with dummy warheads. These dummy torpedoes were designed to float at the end of their run so that they could be recovered and reused in further testing. Again, torpedoes were expensive. The trouble is, the dummy warheads in the practice torpedoes weighed less than the actual torpedoes with live warheads would. A practice torpedo set to run at, say, 20 feet performed just as it should. But in wartime, with the extra weight of a live torpedo, submarine captains found that they were running 10 feet or more deeper than the setting, causing them to pass harmlessly under the enemy ships. When submarine skippers discovered this, they compensated for the depth problem by setting the torpedoes to run more shallow. But this only unmasked another problem with the Mark 14: duds. Submarine captains were reporting a large number of duds, premature detonations, or no detonations at all. Now, to detonate the torpedo warhead, the Bureau of Ordnance had developed the Mark 6 exploder. The Mark 6 had two ways to detonate the torpedo. First was a contact exploder. Just as it sounds, the contact exploder would detonate the warhead when it hit the side of the enemy ship. The contact exploder on the Mark 6 was in many ways similar to the one previously used on the smaller Mark 10 torpedoes. But the Mark 14 torpedoes were 50 inches longer and 25% larger in mass. The Mark 10 weighed 2,200 pounds, but the Mark 14 was over 3,100 pounds. The speed at which the torpedo traveled from the submarine to the target had increased as well, from 30 to 46 knots respectively. The faster a torpedo traveled, the less time the target would have to evade it. In the first 2 years of the war, from 1942 to the fall of 1943, submarine captains were reporting that torpedo after torpedo was being fired. Some were even being observed to hit the side of the ship and failing to explode. In some cases, this failure rate was reported to be as high as 70 or 80% of all torpedoes fired. A prime example is the USS Sargo. In December 1941, during 7 separate attacks, Sargo had fired a total of 14 torpedoes. One exploded less than 10 seconds after firing, and the others failed to explode at all. These same reports were coming in from sub after sub. Commander Dudley Walker Morton of the USS Wahoo fired 10 torpedoes at 9 different targets in August of 1943. All 10 either broached, made erratic runs, or were duds. Furious, Captain Morton requested an early termination to their 6th War Patrol and returned to Pearl Harbor. Wahoo and her crew had been the most successful performing submarine to the Navy up to this time. For example, on Wahoo's 3rd War Patrol, she crippled a Japanese destroyer by breaking its back with a dangerous down-the-throat shot and forcing it to beach. Wahoo then went on to sink an entire convoy of 4 ships comprised of 2 freighters, a transport, and a tanker, in spite of the torpedo problems. But the Bureau of Ordnance would not relent. In their pre-war tests, such as they were, the Mark 14 functioned as intended. Therefore, the problem must be with the ineffective captains blaming their lack of success on torpedoes. An ideal firing position for any submarine is to be 90 degrees to the port or starboard of the passing enemy vessel, with the broad side of the ship toward either the bow or the stern of the attacking submarine. This provided the largest target. The submarine then would fire a spread of between 1 to 3 torpedoes, leading the ship from bow to stern or front to back. This is, of course, depending on the target and the range from the submarine. Large capital ships, like say an aircraft carrier, might warrant a larger spread and therefore more torpedoes. If the firing solution is correct and the torpedoes perform properly, at least 2 of the 3 torpedoes should intersect the ship's course and send it to the bottom. This was a tried and true method used for nearly 3 decades by every submarine force in the world. In January 1943, when Rear Admiral Robert English, then Commander Submarines of the Pacific, was killed in an airplane crash along with his entire staff, Rear Admiral Charles Lockwood was transferred from commanding submarines in Australia to Pearl Harbor to replace him. Lockwood, a former submariner himself, listened carefully to his captain's reports and immediately went to work to uncover the Mark 14's numerous problems. They would fire live Mark 14s into the cliffs off, and I know I'm going to butcher this, but Kahului, Hawaii. Duds were retrieved and the exploder mechanism removed for inspection. Additional trials used a crane to drop the warheads filled with sand instead of high explosive from a height of 90 feet so that the velocity at impact would match the torpedo's running speed of 46 knots. In these drop tests, 70% of the exploders failed to detonate when they hit the target at a 90-degree angle. When the test warheads struck their targets at what would be considered a glancing blow, around 45 degrees or so, the exploders showed a much higher rate of setting off the warhead. What they found was that the transfer of kinetic energy from a 90-degree impact was so great it would damage the firing pin guides, binding the firing pin and preventing the torpedo from detonating. On some tests, the force was so great it popped the exploder completely out of the torpedo altogether. Now, a number of fixes based on these tests were undertaken at the Pearl Harbor Torpedo Workshop. Among them, they strengthened the exploder's firing pin guides and added a stronger firing pin spring. This, along with a few other modifications, greatly increased that torpedo's reliability. But faced with irrefutable proof and with the backing of Fleet Admiral Chester Nimitz, the Bureau of Ordnance and the Naval Torpedo Station in Newport immediately began to implement the fixes that were developed at Pearl Harbor. The fixes worked and the Mark 14 finally had a reasonably reliable contact exploder. But then came the next one. In addition to the contact exploder, the Mark 6 also had a new super secret magnetic exploder, and I say this completely tongue-in-cheek. The Mark 14 exploder should have no difficulty destroying the hull of, say, a freighter or a tanker, sending it to the bottom. But the belt armor and torpedo blisters that had been developed around capital ships such as battleships and cruisers protecting vital spaces had become stronger and thicker with each new class. It was doubtful that the new Mark 14, even with its more powerful warhead, would be effective against these defenses. Designated as Project G53, the new magnetic influence exploder was based on the German World War I magnetic mine. It must be noted that every nation who had tried to develop a magnetic influence feature for their torpedoes had abandoned it as unreliable. How it's supposed to work is like this. Every steel ship has a magnetic signature, naturally produced by the Earth's own magnetic field. With the new magnetic influence feature on the Mark 6 exploder, the torpedo would be fired to run beneath the enemy vessel and detonate the warhead, creating a large void causing the ship's unprotected keel to fail, essentially breaking the ship's back. This concept worked reasonably well for mines because they were stationary and never moved once deployed. The problem is, the Earth's magnetic field is not constant. It varies in strength from place to place. A ship's magnetic field will vary as well. A big capital ship may produce a large and strong magnetic field. A smaller vessel may have very little. To combat magnetic mines, the British Navy used a process called degaussing to great effect. In degaussing, a large copper cable is run around the ship and an electrical charge passes through it. This process greatly reduces a ship's magnetic field. During development of the magnetic influence feature on the Mark 6, a number of tests had been conducted by the Bureau of Ordnance, and, like the contact exploder, none with a live torpedo. I will never advocate that the Bureau of Ordnance, in development of the magnetic influence feature, didn't do everything that they could at the time and with what they had to ensure that this feature worked properly. I believe they did, but still, like a parent protecting a wayward child, the Bureau of Ordnance stood by their magnetic influence feature even when submarine captains returning from war patrols told a different story. They found that sometimes the magnetic exploder would detonate the torpedo well short of the target, and sometimes the torpedo passed harmlessly under the target without exploding at all. Against orders, some submarines disabled the magnetic influence feature of the Mark VI exploder. This, in conjunction with the fixes to the contact exploder, greatly increased the number of reported hits. As more and more data showing the poor performance of the magnetic feature was collected, the Bureau of Ordnance finally relented, and the magnetic feature was finally deactivated permanently. It had taken close to 2 years, but US submarines were finally starting to get a torpedo that worked. Mostly. In 1942, Germany brought unrestricted submarine warfare right to America's front door. U-boats hunted and sank hundreds of merchant ships and tankers all along the U.S. East Coast. When several German G7E electric torpedoes had accidentally run ashore, they were captured and taken to the Bureau of Ordnance. Now, the biggest advantage of the electric torpedo was it did not produce a wake of bubbles or turbine exhaust pointing back to the submarine, firing it like the Mark XIV did. The disadvantage, it was slower, only achieving a speed of around 29 knots compared to the Mark XIV's 46. The batteries on the Mark XVIII required regular charging and gave off deadly hydrogen gas. In one incident on board the USS Cod, in the after torpedo compartment, a crewman was disconnecting the charging cables from a Mark XVIII when a spark set off the hydrogen gas that had accumulated and the batteries caught fire. The fire was so hot that the CO2 extinguishers failed to put it out. The compartment quickly filled with a dense black smoke that made it impossible to see. The upper hatch was open to help vent it to the outside. In trying to get the topside hatch open, a wave washed over the stern of the submarine, and Quartermaster Second Class Lawrence E. Foley and Seaman First Class Andrew G. Johnson were washed overboard. After a great deal of effort by the brave crew of the USS Cod, the burning Mark XVIII was finally loaded into the torpedo tube and fired, sinking harmlessly to the bottom of the ocean. After an extensive search, Quartermaster Foley was eventually found. After hours in the water, an exhausted Seaman Johnson, who was without a life vest, was unable to hang on to Foley any longer, who had been wearing one. He slipped beneath the waves and he drowned. Like any new weapon, the Mark XVIII had a number of defects. It would, on occasion, not activate after being fired and simply sink into the abyss. Sometimes, the torpedo would broach and run wild, hopping and skipping off to who knows where. Like the Mark XIV before it, the Mark XVIII would sometimes go into a circular run back at the submarine itself. One circular run Mark XVIII sank the USS Tang during their 5th war patrol. And, like the Mark XIV, some of these defects would be resolved along the way, while others were never fixed. By war's end, the Mark XVIII would account for about 30% of all the submarine torpedoes fired. The submarine, of all ships, was a unique creature. It was equally at home both under the surface as well as on it. The men who fought in them, and this can never be overstated, had a bravery unlike most of us have ever seen. All submarine crews were volunteers. They didn't just get assigned to a submarine like you would, say, a destroyer or a cruiser. You had to volunteer for the silent service, and the submarine school at Groton, Connecticut was deemed by most one of the most difficult schools in the Navy. Now, data varies, but it is clear that more than half of who attended were unable to complete this difficult training. And even if you did, you were still not yet qualified in submarines. That would take an average of 2 war patrols to get your twin dolphins. You had to be not only proficient at your job on board the ship, as, say, a torpedo man, but you had to at least know how to do the others as well. They were thousands of miles from home, in a 300-foot steel tube, alone in enemy-controlled waters, with no hope of rescue if anything could go wrong. That, in and of itself, is a singular form of valor. After Pearl Harbor, the men of the U.S. submarine force carried the fight to the enemy, when the Pacific Fleet had very little with which even to fight. By war's end, the Japanese merchant fleet and much of its navy had been all but destroyed by U.S. submarines. no longer able to supply their island empire, build ships, planes, even feed their people, Japan was doomed to defeat. I hope everybody enjoyed this. I hope you learned something about the submarines and the torpedoes and the men who fought in the silent service. Coming up soon, we're going to start going over some war patrols and let you learn a little bit more about those who fought in these submarines. So, for Echoes in Time, I'm David Brown. Thanks for watching.